we are live.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You may continue.
Good. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'll call the meeting to order. Can I have mover and seconder to do that, please? Councillor Ma and Deputy Mayor Coughlin, that the special meeting of the Council of Township of Springwater of January 20th, 2021 come to order at 5 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Due to COVID-19, Council is taking the necessary steps to limit in-person meetings, and therefore members of Council and staff are participating in the meeting electronically. The meeting is being live streamed and is available for watching. If you look on the website, www.springwater.ca, you can listen to the meeting during the meeting by cell phone by calling 647-558-0588 and using the ID number 883-3646-8070, followed by the pound sign. This is available during the meeting, and if you're unable to do that and still want to watch the meeting, you can watch the YouTube video where there's a link for that on the website. Councillor, are there any disclosure of pecuniary interests? All right, I don't see any. So we next are dealing with a presentation by Gary Scanlon, Daryl Abbs of Watson and Associates. So I welcome them. A presentation on the update of the long-range financial plan. Now, before we start, ladies and gentlemen, there'll likely be a number of questions with respect to this. So due to the nature of the material, would it be all right with the presenters to have these raised as we proceed through the presentation of cards by council members, and then I'll pause you and then we'll ask the question. Is that all right with the presenters?
I'm fine with that, Mr. Mayor.
Good. All right, I'll turn it over to you to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're happy to be here to make the presentation. Daryl Abbs and I have been working on the fiscal impact of growth, and we'd like to summarize our analysis. We haven't released a report yet. We wanted to get everybody's input, insights, and then we'll finalize the document afterwards. I would note that you have seen some of our analysis that will be presented, because we've separated it into tax supported and then rate supported. And towards the end of the year, we made a presentation on the 10-year rate supported budget. So then you've seen that segment, but we've actually extended that out to 2041 to round out the full development impacts. So Daryl's going to control the presentation, so I'll have to ask him to switch slides as we're moving through, which he can do now.
Yeah, just to confirm, I'm sharing the correct slide. You can see it's the correct screen, right? You can see
Yes,
the slideshow.
it looks, yes.
Yep. So we're going to go through a number of topics, but we're not going to extend in great detail. I might note that we have substantially analyzed this work. We worked through with all the appropriate staff, the CAO, treasurer, and then different members of the different services in preparing this. So it's been a collective exercise. So I'll go through the steps. I'll give you an overview on how we've approached the analysis. I'll summarize the growth forecast, because over the next 20 years, it's substantial. You'll be more than doubling, or the projections are for you to more than double your population over that time horizon. And with that, that's going to give rise to a sizable amount of investment on your capital program. It will have an impact on your day-to-day operating expenditures, but as an offset to that, you will be generating additional taxation revenues, et cetera. So we'll summarize our findings for everyone to see. Next slide, please, Daryl. And again. So we are looking at growth throughout the entire municipality. About 71% of the growth that I've noted will actually be within the Midhurst secondary plan area. And then the residual 29% will be in different communities throughout the municipality. I've noted the population will more than double, so we're looking at a rise from about 23,000 people currently up to approaching 49,000 by 2041. So that's 112% increase, or more than doubling during that period. Next slide, please, Daryl. So as I've noted, what we'll be looking at as we step through is one of the key things is the amount of investment that you'll have to make in infrastructure. Obviously, a lot of development, especially in more of the communities, urbanized communities, need water and municipal water and wastewater servicing. There's going to be impact on roads. All of that normally is at or about the time the development occurs in order to allow for that development to proceed. And then subsequent to that, we'll see things such as community centers, libraries, parks, etc., being constructed as the development proceeds. So we'll talk about the infrastructure costs, and then we'll talk about the financing of all of that infrastructure. Some of the infrastructure is going to be, or at least what we've called the base case, is just continuing on with your existing financial policies and seeing what the impacts there are onto your debt capacity. Just for the benefit of the councillors, I probably don't have to remind you, but the province identifies that your annual debt charges cannot exceed 25% of your total own income. So it's almost like if you went to apply for a mortgage, the banks say we don't want more than 25% of your principal, interest, and payments for taxes to go to, so more than 25% of your household income going towards those elements. So it's almost the same type of policy that the province has put into place. Our observation is throughout the piece, it will be a substantial impact on that. And we'll hit that towards the latter part of the forecast. And we'll talk about some policies and then the impact of those policies if council implement them. So then we'll talk about operating costs and then the collective impacts on both your property tax rates as well as the water and wastewater rates over time. Next slide, Daryl. And then once again, move forward. I've noted that in my introductory remarks. So if we look at the long-range plan, we've tried to just lay out the components of our analysis. So up in the top left-hand corner, you can see we'll be looking at the growth forecast, which is not only population related and housing being constructed, so those people are living in the new houses, but we're also looking at employment and the new buildings that will be constructed for non-residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. So that's what the two gray boxes identify, is the growth assumptions that we'll have. And we've looked at it on a year-to-year basis, extending out to 2041. If we drop down to the bottom and look at the purple boxes, we're going to start there because as I've noted, as the growth occurs, you're going to quite often need to invest in the infrastructure before that development even commences. So let's say within Midhurst, the building permits can't be taken out until they have water supply. The major trunks are put down in the areas of Midhurst, and then everybody connects to those to the water system, and similarly to the wastewater. So you've got to build that infrastructure before the first building permit is taken out. So we look often at the implications of building all of that infrastructure either before for water and wastewater has to be constructed earlier on, or then the rest of the infrastructure has to be built as that development proceeds. So we'll look at the timing of that, and we'll look at the total investment in the infrastructure. And then the second box, which is to the right-hand side, takes a look at the financial aspects of funding that. So how much can we recover from development charges? And then how much can we recover through other sources, which may be grants, may be other types of contributions. I would identify as well that within that infrastructure, we've also layered some of your replacement costs for existing infrastructure. Obviously, if we're going to analyze the impacts, we have to take that into consideration, because you have to have tax room or water wastewater room in the rates to contribute towards replacement of your assets. So we've worked with staff. You've got your 10-year planning horizon. We've extended it out longer, but we've also considered with the existing residents, there are contributions towards replacing their assets. So that will have, we have to make tax room and rate room to identify that. So whatever the funding that potentially can hit property taxes or hit your water and wastewater rates, that's what moves to that orange box that's on the right-hand side. Now, we move to the operating side, and you can see that there's two green boxes there. Some of the operating expenditures will be directly related to building the infrastructure. So for example, as soon as we build a water treatment plant, sewage treatment plant, there's a lot of costs just to run that plant initially. So maybe, at full build out or, at full capacity, maybe the annual operating costs are $100,000. When you first open it up, you're probably at $75,000 to $80,000 because there's a certain fixed cost to running those facilities, and then a small incremental operating cost afterwards as growth occurs. So we've looked at the impacts of that infrastructure and the costs that'll arise as a result. The top green box identifies that there are going to be costs that follow the population. So you've got recreational programs or parks programs, library supported programs. Those type of costs follow the population as it grows. So we've incorporated two different views of the operating costs associated with the growth. Obviously, if we have operating costs, there should be an offset on potential revenues that we'll get. And revenues fall into two categories. The first one being more of the user fees, the fines, the fares, licensing, etc. That's a small component of the non-tax or non-rate revenues that we receive. And then the residual falls onto your rates or onto your property taxes as the method for funding those net expenditures. So then, as I say, we put that all together, and that's where on the orange box, we'll talk about the full impacts of the development onto not only the water and wastewater rates, but as well as onto property taxes. And this will be over the 2041 period. I will note that what we'll try and do in some instances is to isolate, because staff posed the question, well, what's the impact of the growth in Midhurst versus the growth in some of the other areas? So we'll try and address those impacts as we move through this analysis. As I say, Midhurst is 71% of your growth. So obviously it has the most sizable cost impact on the operating budgets and the capital. Next slide. And again, please. So once again, we've talked about the growth forecast. You can see that of the growth of almost 26,000 people over the planning horizon, about 18,400 are in Midhurst, and then about 7,400 are throughout the rest of the municipality. and that translates into about 8,600 residential units. A combination of singles, low density, medium density townhouses, high densities apartments. We've also given you the non-residential growth and the employment. So you can see we've got about 3,600 employees expected, with about almost 2,000 of those employees being in the Midhurst secondary plan area and the residual 1,600 elsewhere. And we have the corresponding square footage of building space for that employment. Next slide. And just to demonstrate graphically the forecast over the 2041 horizon, you can see that we grow by, in the first 10 years, we're going to grow by about 9,000 people. And then it accelerates, or there's a greater level of growth in the latter part of the forecast. So it's not quite linear. We've looked at the timing of when the potential developments could proceed, depending on their applications and discussions. So this is feedback through staff on their best guesstimate of how fast this development will come forward, and then how fast the take-up will be. Now, one thing I'll note is it's a little slower on the first 10 years, and it's faster on the back. That does help to perhaps slow down some of the investment on the infrastructure in the first 10 years versus the latter 10 years. So it sounds like, gee, it would be nice to get it more upfront and slower later. But keep in mind, there's a huge investment in infrastructure to allow that development to occur. So at a slower or more steady in the first 10 years is actually helpful from that perspective. Next slide, Daryl, please. This just once again gives you, in a slightly different form, these are the housing units for Midhurst, which is the blue, and then the remainder of the township. And it gives you in 5-year blocks how many units are expected during those 5 years. So the first 5 years, we're running at about 1,100 units. The next 5 years, we're running at about 1,650 units. The subsequent 5 years, we're running at about 2,600 units. And then in the last 5 years, we're running at about 3,200 units. So it's staging up over time. And that's where I say there's kind of an uplift in the latter part of the forecast versus the first 10 years of the forecast. Next slide, please. So this is talking about the potentially the revenue side, so the tax-supported revenue that we would expect to receive. We've gone through and we worked with staff. We've looked at the assessment that we would believe would come through Midhurst, and then we've looked at the assessment that would be generated through the rest of the municipality. And for the rest of the municipality, which is the top, so all areas other than Midhurst, we've looked at growth throughout the municipality. We've looked at units that are basically younger units. They've been built in the last 5 to 7 years. And we've taken a look at the average amount of assessment which is generated for each of those units. So you can see we have $600,000 per single family home on average, and then about $220,000 for the medium density. And we haven't got a lot of detail with respect to the high density, so we've had to equal it basically at the same level as the medium. For Midhurst, because it's a different probably development plan, we've actually looked to the south, and we've looked at several hundred units within Barrie, and looking once again at the newer 5 to 7 year old houses that are constructed, and looked at the assessment that's been generated in Barrie as kind of a surrogate for what we would expect to see in Midhurst. Now, keep in mind the house sizes generally will probably be a little bit smaller than what we see across the rest of the community. The lot sizes will be a little bit smaller. So the assessed value will be correspondingly a little less than what we currently see in throughout spring water. And you can see the medium and high density generally are in and around the, on average, $300,000. So the far right column says if we look at the growth forecast, we multiply it by this assessment. In the rest of the spring water, we'd look to generate about $1.3 billion of assessment over the next 20 years and about $2.6 billion within the Midhurst secondary plan. So in total, we're approaching $4 billion of new assessment based on today's assessment base.
Question, Mr. Scanlon, Councillor Ritchie?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. In regards to your assessment, Mr. Scanlon, I have some concerns there. I was on MPAC's webpage, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but assessment ran from 2016 to 2020. And of course, we're into 2021 now. So I'm assuming this assessment is for the 2020 era. Having said that, MPAC froze. They haven't made a move on any new reassessment. Given the way the market's been over the last year, and I'm sure you must be well aware of the jumps in prices, there's going to be a lot of new assessment there come available when they open this up. And you make no mention of this at all in any of your presentation here. And I find that very disappointing and very misleading because it all boils down to dollars and cents. Yet you've said nothing about that and why.
That's a very good question, Councillor, through you, Mr. Mayor. Very good question. And it's quite straightforward to explain. We've based all of the analysis based on today's assessment and without any reassessment being undertaken. As we move forward, we know that there's going to be reassessment, but normally what the reassessment does is it redistributes within the township. If we redid the assessment this year, there may be newer houses that actually get reassessed a little bit higher, older houses maybe a little bit lower. But from a property tax bill perspective, if there was no change, everybody went up by 20%, there would be no change in the tax bill. So I guess the way to explain it is the values will change, but let's say today you had $1 billion worth of assessment, and then you look at your taxation bill and you can see how much you pay. If everybody if the MPAC reassessed everybody and everybody increased by 20% to reflect new housing prices, you would end up with the exact same tax bill. Because if you need to recover $1 million and you're dividing it by the $1 billion, whatever, and then subsequently you're taking that same $1 million, but now dividing it by 1.2 billion, your tax rate will drop, but the value of your house is increased. You'll end up paying the exact same property tax bill. So what we've done here is to freeze the assessment so that when we show you the actual impacts on the taxpayer, we're not distorting it by shifting the taxes up and down depending on the age or the type of your house. Does that help to explain? We're not doing anything other than to freeze the assessment so that you can see the true impact on your property tax rates.
Follow on?
Well, first off, we gather in the 2020 year, it was like, and our CAO could tell, I think we're 250, 300,000 in new assessment. Well, that's probably from new bills that's gone up in the township. And there again, that raises a concern. here we are talking about Midhurst, but there's been never no mention about the last 10 years of the growth that we've already had in the township. Nothing. Stone Manor Woods was over 700. We had Snow Valley out there with Cameron Estates with 80. Like if you looked around the township, there was 800 lots. We grew, we hired, we bought new snow plows. Nothing's ever been mentioned about how we handled that. We did it very effectively too. And I find that to be very disappointing when all these studies are done. And not to mention, Mayor Allen, you can chime in on this. How many of these studies have been done on the Midhurst secondary plan? And we keep seeing these studies. This new assessment, to get back to the assessment, if they come out and they reassess it, that's going to be more money, which will throw everything you're doing there right out the window. So I find that disappointing. And one more thing too, you're talking and making it sound as if we got to put all the pipe in the ground and do everything. That's up to the developer to do that, not us. And
Well, I think we get into the possibilities of that we're going to have to seek funding. That's later on in the presentation. But
I find this very, very misleading and very disappointed that we spent this kind of money on this kind of report and get this kind of stuff here. We could have done this ourselves with the amount of reports that have been done. You sat on the committee, Mayor Allen, along with Councillor Hanna, without having to see this kind of stuff. Very disappointing. We could have spent our money a lot better somewhere else.
Thank you, Councillor. I had a question with respect to the residential areas other than Midhurst. You say low density, $600,000. When we take a look at the average assessed value, when we're looking at a budget, it's about $450,000, $480,000 presently for an average assessed house in Springwater. So that 600 for low density outside, excluding Midhurst, seems a little on the high side. Can you comment on that, Mr. Scanlon?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. As I've noted, we've looked at the newer homes. So we've looked at the assessment associated with newer homes, which generally yield a higher assessment amount. If you've got a 100-year-old home, the assessed value of a 100-year-old home, since it's based on market value, would tend to be lower than a brand new house, which has been constructed over the last few years. So what we've done is isolate the units that have been constructed in the last 5 to 7 years, and we've used those averages for this purpose in order to basically focus in on the assessment arising from newer units that are being constructed.
Okay, thank you. I see C.L. Schmidt came on. Did you have a comment, C.L. Schmidt, or we just suddenly see you there in the?
No, Mr. Mayor, I was just, there was conversation about assessment, and just wanted to reiterate what Mr. Scanlon was talking about with reassessment there, that essentially there is that redistribution of assessment. So you're not getting any new revenues, if you will, but as you add new properties, if you will, which is what this slide is really indicating, is the number of units over the next 20 years, which is around 8,600 units. As Mr. Scanlon indicated, you can anticipate on revenues of additional revenues of over $4 billion. So there is more revenue coming to the township. Right. Over the 20-year time frame.
Councillor Cabral.
Sorry, Mayor Allen, it's okay. Pass on my question.
Okay, please proceed, Mr. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if we go to the next slide, we've done a similar type of thing on the non-residential. We've looked at commercial versus industrial versus institutional buildings, and we've assessed the value associated with on a per square foot basis for these different types of buildings. And as you can see, the square footage times the average assessed value gives rise to about another $450 million worth of assessment. So you get 90% of the assessment basically arising from new residential, and about 10% of the new assessment arising from commercial, industrial, institutional. Next slide. So at a very high level, the infrastructure that would be looked at over the 20 years is $751 million worth of investment. You can see that probably about 460 million of that is tax supported, and then there's about 280 million, which is the water and wastewater infrastructure. Now, we've given it to you in the first 10 years versus the second 10 years. They're fairly equal in expenditure during those two time periods for both water and wastewater. You can also see that we've not only addressed the growth-related cost, but we've also included some replacement costs, that being life cycle for your existing assets. So this does build in some of your planned refurbishments and replacements for your existing infrastructure. And then on top of it, there's the new growth that we'll have to finance. So in total, the plan we've got is $751 million worth of expenditures. Next slide, please. This is the financing of the tax supported side. So what we have provided for is the growth related projects, which you can see are basically funded by development charges or by developer contributions. Now, the developer contributions right now on the tax supported is for Midhurst to pay for their roads and to pay for their parkland. There's also the water wastewater, which is on the next slide. But currently, the developer contributions are arising from Midhurst. The rest of the growth is basically cash flowed through development charges being collected at the time of building permit, let's say. And sometimes our cash flow is inadequate. So you can see that there's a significant amount of debenture borrowing that have been looked at right now. So your current policy, Midhurst, you're going to have to pay for upfront for your costs. The rest of the growth will contribute at the time of building permit. And based on that cash flow, we're going to have to go out and borrow a sizable amount of money in order to cash flow the infrastructure. The next slide. Similar type of assumption, you can see Midhurst for the water and the wastewater. They'll be paying fully for all of their assets. So the major water mains, the treatment facilities, et cetera, they'd be contributing. There is a sizable amount of infrastructure that still has to be constructed. And we've looked at funding that through, once again, DCs and then some level of debt. We've also got developer contributions in Hillside for the water side. Next slide. So I'll come back to this because the growth related debt is something that we'll want to revisit because, as I say, our forecast right now is that unless we change some of our policies with the developers that allowing this to proceed, we're going to exceed our debt capacity, and I'll show you that in a minute. The operating expenditures have been broken into tax supported and rate supported. So this is the tax supported one. We've given you the expenditures. Now, these do include inflation within them. So there's a rise in costs associated with natural inflation. And as well, we've split the costs into what's the impact of growth everywhere else except for Midhurst, and then what's the impact if we layer the Midhurst on top. So the blue, which is the blue line, is the full impact that includes Midhurst. And if we back out the operating costs associated with them, so that's the roads, the parks, the recreation facilities, etc., you can see that the line is has much less of a slope. And you can see in the numbers above, we're looking at average increases without Midhurst ranging at 1 to 1.4% average annual increase during those periods. But if we add Midhurst into the mix, then our overall expenditures are ranging from about 3 to 3.5% on an average annual impact. On the next slide, we'll show the rate supported. Oh, sorry, this slide shows you the corresponding, if we look at non-tax revenue, so these are the fees, the fines, the fares. Right now, you've got a little over $4 million as non-tax revenues to help shift the burden off of property taxes. As we move out over time, you can see that the increases will keep pace basically with inflation, but they're not sizable. So they won't add a significant contribution to your overall revenue needs. Next slide. Now this is the water and the wastewater. The first 10 years, you will recall that we've presented this to you in December. And that blue line for the first 10 years is what our rate study was based on. We've continued to extend that out to the end of the forecast. You can see the water and wastewater rates are a little bit higher than the impacts on the tax supported. And a lot of that is due to the Midhurst plants being brought on stream and the associated infrastructure that you have to do the water main flushings every year, water main breaks, etc. The orange line is if we remove the costs associated with Midhurst. And you can see that if we removed Midhurst, the actual water wastewater rates or the expenditures aren't as significant. Now, keep in mind that in the early stages with Midhurst, we're building 2 water treatment facilities and we're building a sewage treatment facility. So the operating costs that arise from that are quite substantial. That's why we see a considerable increase in your operating expenditures. Next slide. And again, please. So we've looked at the tax supported, the rate supported forecast. So this is the overall impact onto your rates. And if we go to the next slide, what we've tried to portray here. So this is your tax rates. So this is, we've got all of these expenditures that we have. Some of them are driven by the capital program. Some of them are increases to support the day-to-day programs. And the increases that we forecast over the next 20 years is basically that blue line that you can see extending out. So starting at 2021, it then starts to rise a little bit more, a little bit higher out to 2031, and then starts to drop back down. What to measure this against is that blue dotted line is just taking your current tax rates today and indexing them at 2% per year inflation. So we've got to relate it to something. So we built inflation into the analysis and such. So we've kind of given you what we expect the impacts to be if you just allowed for inflation on your tax rates. The blue is the overall impacts. The orange and the red is if we separate Midhurst from the rest of the growth in the municipality. And you can see in the very early stages, Midhurst will have a sizable impact on increasing the rates. So that orange line is basically what are the expenditures divided by the amount of assessment that they generate. So they'll have a sizable amount of expenditures with a small amount of assessment coming on stream year to year. So in the first period, you can see they have a sizable impact. As they continue to grow, you can see that that line actually drops down. So in the first 10 years, all the rest of the residents are to some extent subsidizing Midhurst, but in the latter part of the forecast, Midhurst actually is subsidizing the rest of the growth. So it's forcing up the rates in the early stages and starting to mitigate it in the back part of the forecast. And we've given you the annual increases, average annual during those periods at the bottom of the slide. And that's basically what the blue trend line is.
Mr. Scanlon, this doesn't assume any front-end funding by the developers. Is that correct?
Anything that's growth related, Mr. Mayor, there is, if we haven't got enough money in the DC reserves, there is some impact onto the rates. And basically that's what you see in the 2026 to 31 period is there is some there's some growth related debt, which will actually fall onto the rates unless we do some additional policy changes on the development charge size.
Councillor Hanna?
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Scanlon, back on slide 17, no, I think it was slide 20. Anyway, it's not important. We're on this slide now. So because we have all this debt in 2026, if you like, and I'm sorry, the costs, and you're talking about the tax rate to pay for it, could we not increase our debt but extend it over a longer period of time? So instead of paying the $2 million a year to service a debt, which was, I think, on slide 20, we would pay less to service the debt if we took the mortgage, for example. I don't know how long you can do a mortgage, but being a township, I would hope we could do it a lot longer than a 20-year mortgage in order not to pay that $2 million a year to service the debt in 2026 and avoid such a high tax rate.
It's a good question, Councillor. So through you, Mr. Mayor, if we extend out to 30 years, it is difficult to get that financing. It can be available, but you have to make sure that from time to time, it is available and at what interest rate. But to give you a different perspective, if you issue over 20 years versus 30 years, the change in your annual payment is minuscule. So generally, you'd like to go no longer than 20 years. And actually, there is an impact between issuing for 10 years versus 15. But then the benefits of going 15 to 20 are much smaller, and there's negligible benefit to go out to 30 years.
Follow on?
Thank you. Because my other thinking on this is that the current residents or the people that are living in Springwater in 2026, they're basically going to be paying a higher tax rate to pay for this infrastructure for the people that will be moving in 2036 and 2041. So yeah, I guess I'm just seeing more of a negative impact on current residents or the residents in 2026 versus the new residents that would be moving in the new development. Is that correct?
Most of this is tax supported programs. There's a small growth related debt is a small component, but it does have an impact when our DC reserves go negative and you haven't got enough money to pay the debt charges. That's why what we'll present to you later is to identify that by changing your policies and collecting for certain services or like for roads earlier, you can bring down the amount of debt and it mitigates the impact of any growth related debt charges onto your tax rates. What this is really demonstrating is if we take your operating costs, so extra costs for maintaining new roads, because remember, as they build new subdivisions, you will assume those roads at some point. Now you've got to do the snow clearing, you've got to do road maintenance and such. So you have a lot of operating costs. And as I say, generally those operating costs come on faster than the total revenue to support it, like your tax supported revenue. And that's what that first 10-year spike shows, is the expenditures are coming on faster than the totality of the assessment.
Okay, do you want to move on a couple of slides and ask your question, or do you want to ask it now, Councillor Cabral?
I'd like to ask it now, Mayor Allen, if that's all right. It's something that I was thinking about, could be asked. I want to know about the provincial policy statement where they were looking at changing the structure of the DCs and how they were going to be paid rather than all be paid up front, and how that would be, has that been taken into consideration with respect to this report, and how much of an impact does that have on the township's bottom line as far as DCs not being available to finance future infrastructure as it comes online?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, with the recent changes of the Development Charges Act, there's not a huge impact on loss of revenue per se for you through development charges. In fact, they've removed your mandatory 10% deduction, so we can actually change your bylaw to increase your collections for Parks, Recreation, and Library. But with respect to, you're allowed under the Development Charges Act to collect at the time of subdivision, or you can require, at building permit, or you could get for water, wastewater, and roads, you can collect earlier at the time of subdivision. We've also required through agreement with Midhurst for them to cash flow all of your water and your sewer and your roads and your park. So through agreement, that's what we're looking to achieve. So that has already, Midhurst funding their water, wastewater, roads, and parks are already assumed in the analysis that we're presenting to you.
Okay, move on, please.
Okay, next slide. What we've done here is where this is the blue line that was on the back. The one thing we wanted to present is we haven't added on top of it. As the development proceeds and they build infrastructure, they're going to dedicate it to you. While that's nice that you've received infrastructure and you didn't have to pay anything for it, what happens is it becomes, over a long period of time, a liability. You have to replace that asset. So this line here is what we've done is we've said, okay, as those assets are being constructed, all the new assets, there's a long-term liability. So we've done a calculation that says, okay, if you were going to replace this asset, like a water main, and it's going to be 80 to 100 years, you need to be putting a certain amount away in the bank every year so that you can replace it in the future. So we've used that to represent that even though in the short term, there's no immediate impact by assuming that infrastructure, but really you're taking on an additional burden. And that's what the full impact is to say, this is the true long-term impact of development by assuming all of that additional infrastructure. So you can see that over time, that will have an upward push on your rates. And if you look at the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act that the province passed, and you have to come into conformity with doing asset management plans, that's exactly what I'm trying to demonstrate here is you're taking on a liability and ultimately you're going to have to replace those new assets that you're getting per se for free. Okay, next slide. So we've done, this is just observations. So we think generally that the property taxes, are within reasonable levels, I guess, but Midhurst will have a sizable push on your rate increases in the short to medium term. Over the longer term, they'll actually help to assist your tax rates. And that pink line that we presented, that would ultimately push your tax rate another 19% higher over time because you're ultimately going to have to replace all of that new infrastructure. Next slide. Next slide. We've done a similar type of thing with respect to the water. You can see the blue line is basically the full impact. The first 10 years is what we presented to you in the water rate study. If we weren't adding all of the additional costs associated with the water treatment plants for Midhurst, the sewage treatment plant, you can see that the rates would actually potentially drop, or you could hold them steady and you could start to stockpile some of your replacement costs. But this is just, we've pulled out the purely the Midhurst related costs in order to demonstrate the impacts. The pink line gives you the same thing. You're going to assume the assets, but because water and sewer mains last a very long period of time, 80 to 100 years, you can see that the immediate impact isn't as substantial as it is on the tax supported side. On the next slide. So the one with the water, this one is the wastewater. You can see similar types of impacts. You can see similar in the early stages, the existing ratepayers are subsidizing the Midhurst. On the latter part, Midhurst will be helping to subsidize the existing residents. So, next slide. And again. So what this is an area for us to consider, because over time, there's a lot of infrastructure, 750 million that has to be constructed. A lot of that is growth related. And as we've talked about, if we just collect at the time of building permit for the tax supported, and in some cases the water rates and wastewater rates are collected at building permit, there might be an impact of having to build the infrastructure and collect the revenue later, therefore the need for debt. So that's what this line identifies, is that we'll be trending up to towards the latter part of the first 10 years, we would be in excess of 30% impacts. The red line is the provincial maximum. And then we normally recommend not going past 20%, because if you've got projects being constructed, you're going to have to finance with debt per se. There could be a lag between approving a project and when the debt charges start. And if you have an economic downturn and growth slows, you can easily go from that 20% and move up towards the 25%. So these are normally our recommendations, is to not plan debt capacity past 20%. If we look at potential changes to your, Daryl, next slide, please. Okay, so I've summarized this. We're looking at, with the developers, to move towards ensuring that the water and the wastewater for all developers assist in accelerating their payment timing, and as well increasing the contributions with respect to roads in order to offset the debt needs. And if we go to the next slide, Daryl. So basically the hard services being cash flowed by all developers within the municipality. And go ahead, another one, please. So the total amount is really reducing $66 million, accelerating the timing on that and removing it off of debt. And you can see if we move to change our collection policies from developers for water, wastewater, and roads, you can see that we'll drop marginally below that 25% line. There may be some further things that can be done through individual agreements with developers, and that would help to perhaps bring that blue line down a little closer to the yellow, which, as I say, is where our general comfort zone is. Next slide. And next slide. So one of the things you have, as I say, looking at a 20-year period, you have a sizable amount of growth. You have over 20 years, you're going to more than double your population growth. With that population growth, there's a $750 million capital program that's been identified, and that's a sizable amount of expenditures for a municipality that's starting off in and around the 24,000 population range. So getting up to the 48,000, you'll be in a different financial position, but right now, doubling in that time horizon will have a significant impact. So the thing that we're most concerned about is with your DC policies is accelerating the timing of payment for all developers to look to accelerate that for water, wastewater, and roads. And that will help to mitigate your overall debt impacts. There may be other opportunities, maybe delay some expenditures with respect to perhaps library or perhaps expanding a road or whatever, and that will help to stay within it. But I think from a sizable perspective, we're suggesting accelerated payment timing is required from all of your growth developments within the municipality. Next slide. So that's at the end of my presentation, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to take any observations, input, whether now or subsequently through the CAO and the treasurer, and we can move forward with finalizing our study process.
Thank you, Mr. Scanlon. With the maximum adjustment of DCs or pushing forward, advancing DCs, would the maximum allowed under the DC legislation, or is that what restricts us, or is it just negotiations basically outside of the DC legislation? Would it be possible, I presume, to get the debt level to 20% or lower? And what impact would that have on the slide that you showed about the tax increase upfront that needs to be reduced to not overburden the existing residents and smooth it out more until the growth comes?
That's a good question, Mr. Mayor. So under the Development Charges Act, you can mandate collection for water and wastewater and storm as early as subdivision approval signing. One additional benefit is as you go through the secondary plan process, part of the approval of the secondary plan is to put into place financial conditions. And that could be, as you've done with the developers in Midhurst, that they will cash flow front end the water and the wastewater, their roads, and their parkland requirements. So as you go through other significant planning exercises, mandating those payments or the cash flow requirements of that as you're approving those broader plans. If you've already let developments through the gate, so to speak, then sitting down with those developments, or we'll change the development charge bylaw. So at a minimum, we collect the development charge at the time of subdivision approval for them.
And we're in CAO Schmidt, we're in a position to be able to do that. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, as Mr. Scanlon indicated, we would have to go through an update to our bylaw, which we're actually scheduled to do so in 2021 to incorporate some of the recent changes that Mr. Scanlon spoke about earlier. Some of those being, the elimination of the 10% mandatory reduction. We obviously want to make sure that we're collecting, if we can collect 100% on parks or the soft service, some of the soft service components, then obviously we want to do that. And, this isn't something that, just so council is aware, this is something that quite a few municipalities have done. In my previous life in a municipality south of here, that's exactly what we did. We had a collection of road and water and wastewater DCs prior to registration of the subdivision, as opposed to waiting till they were pulling building permits. So you obviously get your cash in advance and be able to use that to construct the infrastructure. So it is something that has been done, and it's not something that only Springwater is doing. Others have done it.
Thank you, Councillor Hannah.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to either Mr. Scanlon or CEO Schmidt. If we're able to do this DC agreements up front and collect those funds, would there be a policy in place to make sure that money goes for the infrastructure costs that will come with the development and not be used for something else, as I guess what I'm suggesting?
CEO?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Hannah, and by all means, Mr. Scanlon, if I speak out of turn, correct me. I believe with regards to when it comes to development charges, those are specific to growth-related projects, and so they would have to be applied or allocated towards growth-related capital projects. They couldn't go towards like a rehabilitation or replacement of an existing asset. So, and if Mr. Scanlon can provide any further direction on that, by all means.
Yes, you've answered it correctly, CIO Schmidt. The one thing I'd note is, depending on the type of agreement you get into, you could direct the expenditures or the revenues directly to certain projects with the developing landowner. Sometimes the developing landowner may actually construct the works and then dedicate it to you, and then you deal with credits. Or you can have them prepay the charges and you'll direct that towards, constructing the road or constructing the water and wastewater. So there's different ways, Councillor Hannah, to structure those agreements.
Follow on?
Well, thank you. And I think Mr. Scanlon just answered my question. I wanted to make sure we understood that the development charges, if we're able to make these agreements, would be area specific. So we weren't, again, caught possibly shorthanded when it came to all the expenses. So thank you.
Okay. Other questions, comments, council? Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Scanlon and Mr. Abbs, for the presentation. So what, review with us what next steps are, please.
After this evening, we'll connect with staff. If there's any subsequent questions or observations or comments from council, we'll receive those through the CIO and the treasurer, and then we'll subsequently finalize the document and have that back to you in short order, along with the recommended policies.
Okay, so if there are any questions or comments, council, forward them to CIO Schmidt, please. Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. While you're doing your study, it'd be nice if you were to take a look at what we've already done over the last 10 years or 5 years with the growth that we've had, how we've managed it, the infrastructure that it's in place. The overall look at that, I think, is very important to me anyways. I'm going to be 11 years now as a councillor, but how we've managed growth, the size of growth, and I think that would help set an example going forward as to what we're looking at here in such a mammoth project. So that's one thing I'd like to see. Take a look at what we've done. That would help tell us where we're going to be going in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we'll work with the treasurer and the CIO to do a bit of a backcast. I think that's what the council is looking at. Let's take a look at the trend line over X number of years, and that will probably provide a bit of a perspective on where we were and where we're moving towards.
Okay, thank you. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive this presentation, please? Councillor Ma Chapman and Councillor Hannah, that the presentation of Watson and Association regarding long-range financial plan be received. All those in favor? That is carried. Any opposed? That is carried. Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen. Can I have confirmatory bylaw mover and seconder, please? Councillor Moore and Councillor Maude Chapman, that bylaw 2021-007 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council at the special meeting held on January 20th, 2021, listed herein, be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? That is carried, and move to adjourn this meeting. Councillor Moore and Councillor Cabral, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 6:05 p.m. to meet again in a regular meeting in January 20, 2021, 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? It is carried. We'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you.